I decided to surprise my husband at his office on our 10th wedding anniversary. He was a CEO, or at least that is what he told everyone who would listen. I had cooked all afternoon, I had a dinner reservation, and I had his favorite bottle of wine sitting on the passenger seat. I walked up to the glass entrance of the downtown tower where he ran his company, and I stopped. Because there was a sign in the lobby, a big one, on an easel with a photo on it. And the sign said, "Congratulations to our CEO, Blake and Sabrina, engagement celebration today at 4, an engagement celebration for my husband and a woman named Sabrina on my 10th wedding anniversary. I stood there in that lobby holding a bottle of wine and I read that sign 4 times. And then I did something that surprised even me. I smiled because my husband Blake had spent 10 years telling me I was nothing without him, that he was the CEO, that he built all of it with his own 2 hands, that I was just a housewife living off his success. And in that moment, standing in front of a sign announcing his engagement to another woman, he had forgotten one thing, one very important thing. The company on that sign, the company he was the CEO of, the tower I was standing in, I own it. My name is Grace. My father built that company from nothing, and when he died, he left the controlling shares to me, his daughter, not to my husband. Blake ran it, but I owned it, and he had just invited 300 employees to celebrate his engagement to another woman inside a building that legally belonged to his wife. By the end of that week, Blake had no fiancé, no company, and no title. He had nothing, and I am going to tell you exactly how that happened, and I promise you it is going to be worth your time. If you have ever been made to feel like you are nothing by the very person who is living off of you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because Blake really should have checked whose name was on the shares before he threw himself an engagement party in my building. Let me take you back. To understand how good it felt to watch Blake lose everything, you have to understand what he took from me first. My father was named Gordon Sutton. He started Sutton Capital with a desk and a phone and 30 years of relentless work, and he built it into one of the most respected commercial real estate firms in our city. That company was his whole life, and I grew up inside it. I did my homework in the conference room. I learned to read a lease before I could drive. And my father always told me, "Grace, one day this is going to be yours because you are the only one who loves it the way I do." I went to business school. I worked at the firm for 6 years in acquisitions, and I was good at it. And then I met Blake. Blake came to work at Sutton Capital as a junior manager, and he was charming and ambitious, and he made me feel like the most important person in every room. We got married when I was 24, and that, looking back, is when the slow theft of my life began. Because Blake was not in love with me the way I thought. Blake was in love with what marrying me could get him. After we married, he began, very gently at first, to push me out of the company that was my birthright. He told me it looked bad for us to work in the same department. Then he told me that my father was grooming him for leadership and that it would be easier for everyone if I stepped back so there would be no talk of favoritism. And I, young and in love and trusting my husband, believed him. I left the firm I loved. I told myself it was temporary. 2 years later, my father was diagnosed with cancer, and everything moved very fast after that. In his final months, my father, weak and frightened, wanted to know the company would be in good hands. And Blake was right there, every day, the devoted son in law, promising my dying father that he would protect the company and protect me. So my father made him the CEO, the chief executive, the man who would run the day to day. But my father, even dying, was no fool, and he did one thing that Blake either forgot or never fully understood. He left the ownership to me. 60% of the shares of Sutton Capital, the controlling interest, went into my name as my separate inheritance. Blake got the title, I got the company. My father made Blake the driver, but he put the car in my name. My father died when I was 28, and I was drowning in grief, and that is the water Blake did his best work in. Because in the years after my father passed, Blake completed the theft. He convinced me that I should not trouble myself with the business, that grief and boardrooms did not mix, that I should stay home and heal and let him carry the weight. He told me my father would have wanted me to be taken care of. And slowly, a woman who had a business degree and 6 years in acquisitions and a controlling stake in a major company became, in her own home, just a wife. Blake controlled the money. Blake went to the office. Blake stood at the anniversary parties and the industry galas and told the story of how he, Blake, had taken Gordon Sutton's little firm and made it great. And I stood beside him and smiled, and every year I got a little smaller. That is the main thing I need you to understand, the thing that made everything that came later so satisfying. For 10 years, my husband lived inside my father's company, spent my inheritance, and used both to make me feel like a woman who owned nothing and was nothing. He would say it right to my face. When I asked about money, he would sigh and say, "Grace, you have never had to earn a dollar in your life. Just let me handle it." When I said I missed working, he would laugh and say, "And do what? You have been out of the game for a decade. You would not last a week." When we argued, his favorite line, the one he used like a knife, was, "You would be nothing without me." You would be nothing without me, said by a man who was standing on my inheritance to reach the shelf. There was one night that I keep coming back to. It was the company's 20th anniversary gala. A big room, 300 people, most of whom worked for a company that I owned, and Blake got up to give a speech. In front of that entire room, he raised his glass and he thanked everyone who had built the company with him, the team, the investors, the vision, his vision. And then he looked at me sitting at the head table in a dress he had picked out for me, and he smiled and he said, "And of course, my beautiful wife, Grace, who reminds me every day that behind every successful man is a woman who lets him work." And the room laughed. A warm, affectionate laugh at me, the little wife who let her husband work. And I laughed too, because that is what you do, and I raised my glass to the man who was toasting himself with my father's company and calling it a gift to me. That was the night I looked around that room, at all those people applauding for Blake, and I felt something I had not let myself feel in years. The quiet fury of a person who knows the truth and has been trained to keep smiling through the lie. I swallowed it that night the way I had swallowed everything, but it did not go away. It just went somewhere deep and it waited. I want to be honest about who I was in those years because I know some of you are wondering how a woman lets this happen. I was not weak, I was grieving, and I was isolated, and I was married to a man who was very, very good at making his control feel like care. That is how it happens. Not all at once. One small surrender at a time, each one dressed up as love. But something in me never fully went to sleep. And in the last year, that something started to wake up. Because Blake got comfortable, and comfortable men get careless. The second thing Blake did, the thing that turned my slow waking into a cold, wide-awake resolve, was Sabrina. Sabrina was the chief financial officer he had hired 2 years earlier, and I had met her exactly twice, and both times she had looked at me the way you look at a piece of old furniture you are planning to replace. I did not think much of it at the time, but over that last year, Blake changed. He worked late constantly. He got a new wardrobe, a new haircut, a gym membership he actually used. He stopped wearing his wedding ring, and when I noticed, he said it did not fit anymore. And then came the papers. One evening, Blake sat me down at the kitchen table, all warmth and concern, and he slid a folder in front of me and said it was just some estate planning, some routine restructuring the lawyers recommended. He told me it would protect us both, simplify things, make everything cleaner, and he asked me to sign. And I looked down at those papers, and even after 10 years of being told I did not understand business, my father's daughter read what was actually on the page. Blake was asking me to transfer my shares, my 60%, the controlling interest in my father's company. He was asking me, in the softest possible voice, to sign away the one thing that was truly mine, and I understood all at once in that kitchen exactly what my husband was doing. He was getting his affairs in order. He was going to leave me, and he wanted to make sure that when he did, he walked out with my father's company, and I walked out with nothing. I did not sign. I told him I wanted my own lawyer to look at it first, just to be safe. And for 1 second, I saw something flash across Blake's face that I had never seen before: fear. Because a woman who wants her own lawyer is a woman who is no longer fully controlled. He recovered quickly, and he smiled, and he said, "Of course, honey, no rush." But that night, I lay awake, and I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what my husband was doing, and then I was going to remember who I actually was. Over the next 3 weeks, I did quietly what I should have done years earlier. I called my father's old attorney, a sharp, loyal man named Lawrence Kemp, who had drawn up the estate and who had never stopped being on my side. I pulled the records I was legally entitled to as the majority shareholder, records Blake assumed I would never think to ask for. And I learned everything. The affair with Sabrina was real, and it was not a secret to anyone at the company except me. The restructuring papers were exactly what I feared, a scheme to strip my shares. And Blake had been telling the board for 2 years that he was the true architect and owner of the company, and that his wife was a silent, irrelevant heiress who did not know a balance sheet from a grocery list. I had everything I needed. And then, on my 10th anniversary, still not knowing that I knew, my husband decided to celebrate his engagement to his mistress inside my building. He handed me the moment on a silver platter. I want to pause here for just 1 second. The stories like this one, where somebody finally remembers exactly who they are, I put on perfect revenge stories first and nowhere else. If you want to be here when the next one lands, go ahead and subscribe and turn on the bell. Now, let me tell you what I did with that engagement party. I did not walk into that lobby and make a scene. I want you to understand that because it is the whole difference between the woman Blake thought I was and the woman I actually am. A weak woman screams in a lobby and gets escorted out and becomes the crazy wife in everyone's story. I set the bottle of wine down on the security desk, and I smiled at the guard who knew me, and I turned around and I walked back to my car. And I called Lawrence Kemp and I said, Lawrence, it is time, do exactly what we discussed and have the documents ready by 4 o'clock. Because I owned 60% of Sutton Capital, and under the company's own bylaws, the ones my father wrote, a majority shareholder can call an emergency vote of the board and remove a chief executive officer for cause at any time. And adultery with the company's CFO, financial self dealing, and attempting to fraudulently strip the majority owner of her shares are about as much cause as a board has ever seen in its life. Lawrence had spent 3 weeks quietly preparing every document, the shareholder records proving my 60%, the board resolution, the evidence of the restructuring scheme, and a very simple, very final notice of termination for the CEO. I told Lawrence to bring all of it to the office, at 4 o'clock, to the party. I walked into my husband's engagement celebration at 10 past 4. The whole top floor was decorated, 300 employees with champagne, a banner with Blake and Sabrina's names on it hanging over the reception desk that my father used to lean on. And there was Blake, in a new suit, his arm around Sabrina, glowing, the king of a kingdom he thought was his. He saw me across the room, and the color drained out of his face. Because I was the one thing that did not belong at that party. He came rushing over, hissing under his breath, Grace, what are you doing here? You cannot be here. This is a work event. And I looked at him, calm, and I said, Blake, it is our anniversary. I came to surprise you, and I have. And then Lawrence Kemp walked in behind me in his gray suit with 2 associates and a leather folder, and I watched my husband realize that his wife had not come alone. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. I stepped up onto the small platform they had set up for the toasts, and I picked up the microphone, and the room went quiet because most of those 300 people had no idea who I was, and the ones who did were suddenly very interested. And I said, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grace Sutton. Gordon Sutton was my father, and I am the owner of this company. The silence in that room changed temperature. I said, I know most of you were told a different story, so let me correct the record. My husband, Blake, is the chief executive of Sutton Capital, but he does not own it. He never has. I hold 60% of the shares of this company left to me by my father, and that makes every decision in this building, in the end, mine. I looked at Blake, whose mouth was opening and closing without sound. And I said, and effective as of 30 minutes ago by a resolution of the board that I called as majority shareholder, Blake is no longer the chief executive of this company. He is no longer an officer of this company. And in about 5 minutes, he will no longer be an employee of this company. Lawrence stepped forward and set the termination notice on the reception desk, right under the banner with Blake's name on it. The room did not explode. It did something better. It went completely, breathlessly silent, the silence of 300 people watching a man they had been afraid of for a decade get unmade in real time. Sabrina, the CFO, the fiancée, stepped back from Blake as if he had caught fire, because Sabrina was a smart woman, and Sabrina understood, faster than Blake did, that she had just gotten engaged to an unemployed man in front of the woman who signed both their paychecks. Blake finally found his voice, and it came out as a kind of strangled shout, You cannot do this. I built this company. I am the CEO. And I looked at him, and I said the truest thing I have ever said into a microphone. I said, No, Blake, you are the CEO. My father built this company, I own this company, and you were an employee who married the owner and spent 10 years telling her she was nothing so she would never look up and notice that she was standing over you the whole time. Well, I looked up. And then I told the room the rest, plainly the affair, the scheme to steal my shares, all of it, because Blake had told his lies about me in that building for 10 years, and I was going to tell the truth in it exactly once. And then I set down the microphone and I asked security, my security in my building, to please escort the former CEO out. And here's the detail I will treasure for the rest of my life. As 2 members of my security team walked toward Blake, he turned to the room, to his 300 employees, the ones he had ruled for a decade, and he looked for a single ally, one person to stand up for him. And not one of them moved, not one. Because a man who rules through fear has no friends, he only has people quietly waiting for him to fall, and they had just watched it happen. And I saw on some of their faces something that looked a great deal like relief. Blake walked out of that building between 2 guards, past the reception desk my father used to lean on, under a banner with his own name on it, and the last thing he heard was 300 people not saying a single word to save him. Sabrina did not walk out with him. She had already found her coat. Now let me tell you how it ended, because a hard revenge is only satisfying if it actually holds. The divorce was not a battle, it was a formality. My father, God bless the man, had insisted on a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, one that clearly protected my inheritance and my shares as my separate property, and Blake had signed it at 26 because he was so sure he would find another way, and he had almost found it in a folder on my kitchen table. But I did not sign. So when the divorce came, Blake's adultery was documented, his attempt to defraud me was documented, and the prenup held like a steel wall. He did not get the company. He did not get the house, which was mine. He did not get a settlement because you do not get rewarded for trying to rob your wife. He walked out of a 10-year marriage with exactly what he brought into it, which was his charm, and even that was worth a lot less now that everyone in the city knew the story. Sabrina left him within the month. Of course she did. Sabrina was engaged to a CEO with a fortune, and what she was left with was an unemployed 40-year-old with a reputation for fraud, and Sabrina had not signed up for that because Sabrina, in her own way, had wanted exactly the same thing Blake wanted from me. She wanted what he could get her, and once he could not get her anything, there was nothing there to stay for. They deserved each other, right up until the second they realized they did. As for me, I did not sell my father's company, and I did not run from it, and I did not hand it to some hired stranger and go back to being a wife in an empty house. I took my father's chair, the daughter who did her homework in the conference room, who read leases before she could drive, who had 6 years in acquisitions before a charming man talked her out of her own life, walked back into Sutton Capital, and ran it. And it turned out I was good at it, the way my father always said I would be, because I loved it the way he did. I kept the employees who were loyal. I promoted the ones Blake had held down. And the first thing I did in my very first week was hang my father's photograph back in the lobby, where Blake had quietly taken it down years ago and replaced it with one of himself. Gordon Sutton looks out over that lobby again now, and every morning when I walk in under his picture, I think about the fact that he knew. Even dying, my father knew exactly who Blake was, and he could not stop me from marrying him, so instead, he did the one thing he could. He made sure that no matter how far Blake pushed me down, the ground I was standing on would always, legally, be mine. So here is the only thing I have for you, and then I will let you go. When someone spends years telling you that you are nothing without them, look very carefully at why they need you to believe it. It is almost always because they are standing on something that belongs to you and they are terrified of the day you look down and see it. Blake told me I was nothing without him for 10 years. It turned out he was nothing without me. He just knew it long before I did, and he spent a decade making sure I never found out. I found out. On my 10th anniversary, in a lobby, in front of a sign meant to erase me, and it turned out to be the best anniversary gift I ever got because it woke me all the way up, and I have not gone back to sleep since. Tell me in the comments about the moment you finally looked down and realized the ground was yours, and I will see you in the next one.